My name is Daria Orlowska. I am the data librarian at Waldo Library, and your guide today as we go through steps for better data management and organization as part of the academic adulting workshop series. So at the end of this workshop, you should be able to understand what is data management and list off all the different components of it. We will also be going through examples of each of these components and talking about strategies that you can adapt for better data management. As we talk about these strategies, I will also be highlighting a few campus resources that you can be incorporating into your workflow. This workshop is really meant to guide you through some data organization and management questions so that you can start thinking about how to apply them to whatever data you may have. Due to the fact that there is going to be a lot of content to explore, I'm not going to be doing a deep dive into any of these concepts today. That being said, I am happy to take any questions during this workshop, so feel free to either unmute yourself or ask me directly, or just type it into chat. I will be monitoring that. It is going to be a little bit information dense, and I'm going to try my best to get through all the material, but if you need me to slow down for any reason, feel free to also type that into the chat. Okay, so without further ado, let's go. What is data? So what do I mean when I say that? Regardless of whether you say data is or data are, the term data is used to indicate a fact or a collection of information. What you consider to be data or what others consider to be data may vary by discipline or what you may have been exposed to in the past. If we take the 2013 Office of Science and Technology Policy Memo on increasing access to results of federally funded scientific research, they define data as recorded factual material necessary to validate research findings, which includes data sets. But for the purpose of this workshop, data is everything. It can be measurements, field or survey data. It can be audiovisual, like videos, audio or music, photos, textual data, such as transcripts, Word documents, bodies of literature, or tweets. Can be physical objects from a collection or specimen samples, or even code. Data can be born digital, so only existing in a digital format, analog, so like paper records, or digitized, where you might be collecting something that's physical and then moving it into a digital space. I'm sure that all of you work with different types of data, but I do ask you to think about certain data that you would like to tackle in this workshop as we're going through each of these slides so that you could have something in your mind to refer some of the reflection questions to. Let's actually, before we move on, if everyone wants to type in really quickly what kind of data you work with, or what are some things that you would like to apply this workshop to? No pressure if you didn't come prepared. If you don't want to type that in, that's fine as well. We could just keep it in the back of your minds as to something that you would like to work on. Okay, so I'm seeing a little bit of quantitative things like measurement data. That makes sense. I think I primarily work with quantitative data as well. So things that are factual, you put them into a spreadsheet. Most of the time my data is tabular as well. Personal experience, okay, so maybe qualitative data. Yeah, there's large gamut depending on your discipline. You might have experience with different types. Okay, and data management. So we talked a little bit about what data is, and data management is pretty much just how you organize, structure, or care for your data. I often say that data management is kindness to yourself and to others because doing a good job taking care of your data means that your future self can have context and access to reuse your data, even when it has been years and you had forgotten the project details. There are several components of data management that we will be talking about today, primarily focusing on the first two. So the first one is file naming, which is structuring your data in a way that enables you to locate the right file without second guessing yourself or wasting time. You have documentation, which is providing context so that you and sometimes others can revisit and reuse your data. You have backup, which is making sure that you can always have a copy of the data to access. And sharing, which is not only receiving recognition for your work, but it's advancing research if you are sharing research data. And if you don't have research data or if that's not what you wanted to work on today, I encourage you to think about sharing as long-term preservation instead. Steps that you can take to ensure that you can always access your files, whether that is in 1 year and 10 years from now. I think it's important to always think about how can you make sure that you can revisit a project in the future. Okay, let's jump right into file naming. So I wanted to begin, this was actually an activity. No pressure, low stakes activity. So let me give you the context. Let's say that you are working on a project where you're investigating snail depictions in medieval manuscripts. You see here on the left-hand side is an image that's actually from our medieval document collection. You can find that online. And you can see there are two snails in it. You have some additional information here about the manuscript that I have provided. And I'd like you to think about how you would name this document, given the fact that you're interested in a specific part of it and that you have some additional information, like you have the title, where it comes from, you have the date, the location, and a little bit of the description. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this up in Slido actually, so that you can type in your answer. I'm gonna play along as well. You don't have to think about it too hard. Just go ahead and provide a name based on some of the things that you may know. And then I'm gonna give you a few minutes, or I'm gonna give you a minute rather, and then I'm gonna go ahead and make the results visible and we can reflect a little bit about this. Okay. Um, so we have two names. I was trying to put mine in, but I guess I can't actually put mine in. If I were playing along, I would have put something like um, 1544 underscore CIST, anti, which is the title of the document, 23 underscore simple snails. But you have something like 2 snail Belgium, 1544, and we have someone put in explore, as in this is like maybe a snail exploration. So if you think about all these different file names. Um, Everyone kind of had different answers, depending on, what they thought was the most important or what would be a good indicator of what this might be if they wanted to find it in the future. How do you think prioritizing worked here? What were some things that people might have prioritized? What was omitted? Did they use any acronyms or abbreviations? And did that make it more or less understandable? How about the length? How easy is it to scan for the files? Are they unique names? Can they be easily duplicated in another manuscript? So if we found another manuscript that would it have a similar file? So for example, if there was another manuscript from Belgium, would it would you have named it something similar? So let's put a pin in this discussion, um, and look at some other examples, and we'll ask a few other questions before we continue. Yeah, so we have someone had put subject, time, location. Yeah, that's a good convention to think about. You have a subject, so your snails and what time comes from a location. I actually did something similar. I think I flipped it a little bit. I put time and then I put manuscript name and then I put subject. So my priorities were a little bit different than yours. But depending on how consistent you are, that things can be equally findable no matter what your conventions are. So here's an example of a fictional student's files from the Piled Higher and Deeper comic by um, Jorge Cham. So what do these file names do well? What do they do less well that can be improved upon? So I think when I look at this file is that it does a good job of sorting out files. So you can see all your data files together, but you have some problems with versioning. It's difficult to determine without looking at the timestamp which file is the most recent. It's impossible to figure out what has been done to each file. Clearly, there was some anger, and maybe the author wanted to go back to an earlier version of the file, and it would have been really difficult to do that. It's also really hard to find what was the original file. Maybe you had a raw data file, but is that even in here? If you sent um, a file to a colleague and the program would suddenly strip the metadata from it, it would be very difficult to tell when something was created in what order. And if you moved some of these files accidentally out of the folder, you might have a really hard time determining what project that they belonged to. So those are some things to keep in mind. If if they are separated out from the folder that they're contained in, can you still tell what they belong to? And if you don't have the inbuilt metadata within the program, can you still figure out what something is the most recent? Okay, so here is some other file naming, and this refers to organization. So in addition to wanting to create a file name for your individual files, you also want to think about things like what is the folder structure. So here is an example of my folder structure for a project that I'm working on, where I have a series of folders that house other folders or files. And for this what this illustrates is importance of order. So what is the most important thing that you want to sort on? And do you need to create additional folders in order to support this? For this project, the most important thing that I wanted to do was to sort by date. And so as you can see, all my files begin with the ISO format, which is year, 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 month, month, day, day. And I use that convention because it is easier to sort things chronologically. Year changes the least, followed by month, and followed by day. So everything is always going to be sorted correctly by the date. I also by making sure that I'm following my convention throughout all my file structures. It means that if I'm ever uploading these files, which I do, I upload them into ScholarWorks, I don't have to um, go ahead and change my file names. They're already ready to go. And having a standard also makes things easier to find and sort by. So for example, if I'm interested in hospital data, which in my case, I have labeled all of those with an underscore COVID bed PPE, I can use the search bar at the top of the Windows, the window that pops up in order to search for just that extension, and I will get all the files within that series. And it will be easier for me to copy things over and put them in a different folder or upload them in a zipped file, for example. So this is an example of what I just explained. So searching for just an extension. And because it is standardized, I can get a list of those 567 files over the course of several days. Working with others might also require you to clearly define your naming system to maintain findability. So in this case, the author has decided the most important way to sort files is by project, followed by group, file type, and date. This naming system also provides a controlled vocabulary for individuals to use and provides directions for use. What I mean by controlled vocabulary is that it lists out the options, so you can't decide you can't make up an extension for project name, you just have all the projects listed. And this is a really good strategy if you're working with several individuals, whether you're in a lab or you have other collaborators, because oftentimes, as we found out in our activity, people might find different things important. And when you're trying to find a file, you want to make sure that you're being very consistent with file naming conventions, or otherwise you might be looking for a really long time, or you'll actually have to open up the files and find out what's in them in order to figure out if you've picked the right one. Okay, so we talked about a few things today in terms of file naming. So I wanted to summarize what are some best practices. I think coming up with a file structure distinguishable from other projects is a good strategy. So if you accidentally move a file out of one folder, but everything had already been named data and a date, that might make it difficult if you have several projects to find out what that belongs to. So avoiding same names for subfolders across different projects is a good strategy. And you also want to create something that's easily understood by others. If it's overly complicated, it might be very difficult for you or for others to remember exactly what an abbreviation means. It's important to think about the logic behind the file naming. So as we talked about, establishing information importance for sorting. What is the one thing that you want to find straight off the bat? Creating a controlled vocabulary is also a very good strategy for making sure everyone is on the same page. And deciding where your system can be accessed. You can have this great file naming system set up, and that's not going to help anyone if it's hidden in a place where no one can access. So for example, you might be in a lab and you might have physically printed out a system and taped it up on your monitor. And that could be a good strategy. You could place it in a folder, or you can create a file. Maybe if you have it, I don't know, like on Google Drive, it could be the first thing that people see. And some naming practices that are important to think about. When naming files, avoid using spaces and special characters to make your files machine readable. So if you're ever wanting to upload them into a program, the things can be parsed differently. So if you just avoid those things, it avoids problems in the future. If you're writing in a date, I would recommend you use ISO format. So that's the year, month, day, because it will allow for the best chronological sorting. And it also helps if you're dealing with international colleagues or if you're sending it to someone who might live in a different country. because not everybody uses the same convention as the United States does. I would also consider your how many files you may need in the future. So if you're hoping to generate a lot of files and you're numbering them, consider if you maybe need to number things 001 to accommodate up to 999 files. And also consider your software limitations. For example, if you're working with mapping data, ArcGIS will not read in files that start with numbers. It's just a quirk of the software, so be aware if your software has similar quirks. And so for that, putting the date as the most important piece of information would not be a good idea. It's also important to think about how the software that you're using with the files displays those files. So maybe there's a character limit for file names, or it truncates the view. And so when you look at the preview, you have a hard time figuring out what files you're looking for because it's a lot shorter than what the name that you had inputted. And in that case, you might want to use some abbreviations to make sure that the relevant information is displayed. So just a quick reflection, what file naming conventions might work for your own projects? What are some things that you're already doing? And what are things that you can improve on? Our next data management component is documentation, which I think can be succinctly explained as serving to provide a clear explanation of the thing you are documenting, along with a clear process for working with the thing. And depending on what thing you have, I'm saying thing because you might all have different data needs, uh, you might need different amounts of detail and you might have a very different workflow. So in this example, you might encounter a quantitative research project where the entire project might have a single methodology, which includes things like what has been done, what instruments or software were used, and if they required a specific software version. But the project might have several types of data files that need to be listed out. And then the data set itself might need a code book listing all the variables in it. And then if you drill down even further, you have specific data points or variables that you made decisions on how to group or transform that have specific units, and that might also include decisions about how to identify missing data. So really, you're kind of just drilling down in terms of details. This is very quantitative, but you can easily substitute quantitative data for qualitative data, where you might have a grouping of text files that you organized into themes and perhaps used Python code to conduct text mining on, or a set of pictures in a collection that are grouped by a theme, or scientific models in MATLAB that contain code and outputs in the forms of images and text files. So keep in mind what level of detail you have and what kind of files and what drill down you need in terms of documentation. I'm going to take a quick moment because I realized I didn't ask if anyone has any questions about anything we covered. So I just wanted to make sure that you have a chance to ask about file naming conventions and anything we've gone over about documentation so far. Okay, hearing nothing, I'm going to continue on. So next we will explore some examples of documentation and consider pros and cons of each. And feel free to play along with this if you want to. So this is a picture of a card I made as part of my card catalog. I have a hobby of making cards for individuals, and I have over 200 entries in this catalog. And I use comments to document my process, materials, and time it took to complete each card. So really what I'm doing is that if you go to any image that you might have if you have a Windows computer. I'm sorry, Mac users, I don't use that system, so I can't really tell you how to find these things, but if you are using a Windows computer, if you right click and go to properties, you can pull out this screen. And I'm pretty much inputting my comments into here. So what are some pros of this system? And what are some cons? What are things that work well with this from what you see? And what are things that may not be very good? In terms of my own thoughts about it, some pros for this system would be the automatic metadata. So whenever you have an sort of image or file that you're creating, the program usually creates some metadata automatically. With images, if you took a picture, you have some automatic metadata in the form of resolution or maybe what kind of camera lens was used in what settings. So um, you already have some metadata within the properties, and this is an easy way to attach additional metadata to file and to search for notes. So the same way that I showed you how to search for extensions of files, you can also do the same within any sort of comments or tags that you put in um, to, to the properties of an image, for example. However, built-in metadata can be removed. You see that little remove properties and personal information, and it can also be corrupted. So sometimes you will find that the date within the file doesn't actually correspond to when it was taken, and that might depend on time zone. It might depend on the settings of the instrument that it was used to make the scan or to digitize the object. So uh, that's something to consider, that those things might not be super accurate. But it's also important to consider if you will ever need to extract this documentation. This goes for any type of system that you're putting data into. How might data extraction look like? And how easily can it be done? And can it be aggregated or moved to another system? So in this case, I'm actually not able to extract anything unless I go into each image and copy and paste things and put them into another spreadsheet. So for me, that's okay because I'm not doing anything where I need to aggregate this information. But if you are using something like this for something that you need to extract later on, it's something to keep in mind. The same goes for if you're putting data maybe into an access system, like a database, how easily can you take that data out if you ever need to move it into another system or if you need to aggregate it? Okay, another form of documentation is code commenting. Here's a Python script I created in Jupyter Notebooks for a project that explored creating connections on campus through linking faculty to research topics. One of the pros for this is commenting out your code is a great way to provide you with instruction on what each line of code does so that you can easily replace files, make alterations, and figure out code purpose if you haven't used it in a while. It's also a great reference if you're sending it to someone else and they're looking at your code for the first time, so they don't have to try to figure out or guess what the purpose of each line is. However, commenting things out might not provide a good overview of what the code accomplishes without clicking into it. So it's all contained within the file. You can't just see a file and know what it is. There's no documentation on the outside of it. It's all inside the file. Depending on the software you are using, it might be more or less difficult to access your code without having the same software. So if you're using MATLAB, for example, which is a proprietary piece of software, if you're commenting in it and you're sending your code off to someone else who doesn't have access to MATLAB, they won't be able to see your comments. It also does not do a good job creating associations between files or describing what files are part of your project. So if you have several pieces of code that you're saving as different files or different files that you're pulling into your code, um, just creating a comment between the lines of code might not tell you how those things are connected or in what order they're used. Okay, so this next piece of documentation is an Excel spreadsheet that includes documentation about tracking workshop attendance and feedback. It also includes a reference to what the variables mean and how they were derived, as well as file naming conventions. So the good thing about this is that you have the documentation contained within the document that is using it, right? It's in the next sheet over, it's not gonna get lost, it's right there for you to access and find. However, Excel is a proprietary software, so not everyone might have access to this software, and not everyone can open it up. If you save the file into an open format, like a CSV, sheets become separated and the metadata is no longer linked to the data. So you have this documentation that you created and it's no longer linked to the thing that you were coding. Um, in addition, any other documentation like commenting, highlighting, or data validation that you've created within your Excel spreadsheet is going to be lost. Not only if you're converting into an open format like a CSV, but between programs. That's just something that's specific to Excel. So it's not going to move if you change this into a Google Doc or if you open it somewhere else. Okay. This next piece is a codebook for a research project where participants were prompted to answer questions on a Palm Pilot twice a day for 6 weeks. Those who have never had a pleasure working with this obsolete technology, this is what it looked like. Used to be one of the first handheld computers, early 90s and 2000s. Anyway, this is a document that is great for researchers who are coding their project right now. So if someone has this sheet, this gives them explanations about what each of these columns mean and how what the variables, if they're coded for like no response or missing data, or if there are any sort of units then they need to keep track of. However, this is only helpful for the active part of the project. If you were looking at this later on when you have a data set, this might not really help you understand what decisions were made with coding. It's also not helpful to an external audience viewing the compiled data set as opposed to the raw data. It's also a standalone document that needs to point to a collection of files, and this document doesn't do a good job of that. It doesn't tell you what project this is for and what files relate to it. In contrast, here is another codebook that was created as documentation for a data set that was deposited into OSF, which is a data repository, or it could be a project repository actually. How does this codebook differ from the one that we just saw? So this one has a lot more information, and I would argue that it's made more for an external audience, for someone who doesn't have familiarity with the project. It also lists some general information about the coding structure and then goes into details of each variable, talking about what's the variable name, what was the purpose of it, what type of units were used, what type of variable is it, uh, if there are any missing values, and any other notes that can be spoken of. It also does a good job of if there is a categorical variable, so if things were put into categories, how many of these variables fell into each of these categories. And that can be very important to an external audience because if you download a data set, then you can go ahead and compare what the coding manual says the information should be and what you have. So if you accidentally deleted a bunch of rows, you can find that discrepancy. Okay, and the last piece of documentation that I wanted to talk about was a README file. So a README file kind of can go a step beyond a code book, or it can be kind of an all-encompassing document that just kind of centralizes all the project files. So here's a README file for a Jeopardy-inspired data education game, and it provides context for the files needed to recreate this game. A good README document will be a plain text file that provides guidance for using a data set. Depending on your needs, it can contain information about purpose, methodology, variables, reuse, and contact information. Or it can be a simpler document that just points to related files. Like this README document that pointed to the coding manual we just looked at. However, like well-done code books, READMEs can also take a lot of time to put together. It also needs to point to files, or else as a standalone document, it doesn't do very much. And it has a potential of being done incorrectly, which is not helpful. It's only as good as the time you put into, as well as all other forms of documentation. Okay, so to summarize, adequate documentation is having enough information about projects, methods, and materials such that the information is maintainable over time in an accessible format and valuable for those who need it. We have talked about a lot of different data and what those data might need in terms of documentation, and gone through a few pros and cons about different types of documentations. I will say that this is a time-consuming process, but when done right, and if you put the time in, you don't have to figure things out later from scratch. And even if you are in the middle of a project and are like, Daria, I haven't been doing this, it seems like a lot of work. If you start working on documentation right now, at the point you are, you can then loop back later to work on previous parts of your project, and it will take a lot less time to do that than having to do everything at once at the end. Here are some things to consider as you're creating documentation. Are there any standards in your field, such as any formal schemas, that you should be taking into consideration? And if so, how difficult and time-consuming will it be to adapt them? So you have an example here of a low barrier README template that has some information that's fast and easy to fill out, but it can be irregular and incomplete. Whereas if your discipline uses a specific schema that has a lot of details, it can be very useful to someone because it has a lot of details, it's standardized, they know where to look for. But it can also be a very slow process because it requires you to be familiar with the schema and have some skill filling it out. The other thing you should consider is, will you be able to access the documentation in the future, even if you no longer have access to the software you used to create it in? How easy would it be to extract or aggregate that documentation? And what documentation would you require to pick up the process in a year and know which files to use? Okay. Any questions about any of that? That was a lot of things I just threw at you. I'm going to give you a moment to process and then I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, storage and backup. So we've gone through the two things that I really wanted to focus on in this workshop, which is file naming conventions and documentations. But I did want to talk briefly about the last two things we mentioned, which is storage and backup and sharing / long-term preservations. So this first one is storage and backup. So whether any of you have ever had the sad experience of losing your data, regardless of if it was due to a system crash, a program malfunction, forgetting to save, or because it was in your backpack, laptop, external hard drive, or flash drive, and that got misplaced, stolen, or it broke down for some reason. It's super frustrating to lose your data. Can have years of work on it, but there are things that you can do and things you can implement to prevent some of these things or be able to recover some files. So the best way to think about backup and storage is the 3-2-1 rule for file storage. So if you have an important file, the ideal is 3 backup copies of that file stored on at least 2 media types with at least 1 copy offsite. that's usually in the cloud. So, for example, you have a lot of cloud resources here on campus. You have Google Drive, you have OneDrive, you might have access to other third-party software such as Dropbox or Amazon, or maybe Box. So those are good things to keep in mind in terms of off-cloud storage, that you will always have a file somewhere that you can access through multiple devices. Then you have other storage options. So you want two of those. So if you have things on your laptop, you might also want them in the cloud, or you might want to keep them on a flash drive or an external hard drive. So keep in mind that flash drives and external hard drives are a piece of technology that can also fail. Especially with flash drives, they're small and can be forgotten, lost, or easily corrupted. I think some questions to consider about what storage options would work best for you is how much time would it take to recreate or replace the files that you have? What kind of price would you put on it? In terms of stress and time, what storage option would work best for you if you're working as an individual versus if you're working in a group or lab? And who is responsible for making sure that there are backups, and what frequency do you need to make those backups? So in addition to storage, I would strongly urge you to consider versioning to prevent your data loss from being overwritten, or in the case that you need to access an earlier file if you made a transformation mistake, if you've done some sort of analysis and you decided, no, that was the wrong one to do. There are a few options with versioning on campus. You can either opt to automatically version through OneDrive or Google Drive, or you can manually version by numbering your files, so entering a version number at the end of your file naming convention, and then instead of saving over the file, you save as and create a new file each time you've done some sort of major analysis or transformation on it. However, that does require that you remember to do that. So I just wanted to quickly go over how versioning looks like in Google Drive or OneDrive, because it can sometimes be hidden. So in OneDrive, you can only access versioning through the browser. So if you log into W Exchange and then you use the left menu with those little dots, you'll get to a drop-down menu to access OneDrive. From there, you can find the file you're looking for, and if you click the three dots next to it, you can access the version history and see all the versions. And then you can either view those versions or restore an earlier version if you've made a mistake on the latest one. Versioning in Google Drive is similar. You can access it through the browser as well. You find your file in Google Drive, you right-click on it to go to Manage Versions, and then you have a list of your versions, and you can either download them or delete previous versions. However, keep in mind that both of these, you need to enable syncing through your desktop if you want things to be done automatically. Otherwise, you have to remember to either drag and drop or upload your files, and you have to decide with what regularity you want to do that. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to talk to you about before I let you go today is what might you need to consider long-term storage for? If you are conducting human subjects research at the university, you are required to keep all of that data and files for 3 years after the study closes. Um, but, long-term storage is not just for making sure you're fulfilling some sort of mandate at the university. Perhaps you want to revisit the data during a later project, or you get a request from a colleague to share your data, or you want to give your data to a friend because it might come in handy to them. Oftentimes, we also think of sharing as long-term storage because if you're depositing your data into a data repository, those repositories commit to not only making your data findable, but they will also store your data set for a long time, anywhere from 10 years to indefinitely, with multiple backups in case anything goes wrong. But even if you have been making your files findable and documenting your process and creating backup copies, your data is only as good as your access to it. And if your data is in a format that requires certain hardware, software, or even a specific version of a program to open it up, then all your prep was useless because you might not be able to get into the actual data you prepared for long-term storage. So even if you're working with a proprietary software or unique tool, consider transferring your data into an open, uncompressed format for long-term storage so that you can always use it. I always hear stories about someone reaching out to a researcher and being like, can I have your data? Because I want to reuse it for my own project. And they're like, oh, let me find that on a CD in my garage somewhere. But the CD might have become scratched up and is unusable. Or someone uploads their file online, but it is in a version of a specific software that no longer exists. And so you can't even open it to see the data inside. So these are just some things to think about for the long term for yourself and for others. How can you change the file to always make it accessible? So if you have an Excel spreadsheet, consider saving that as a CSV because that can be opened by multiple different software. If you have a Word document from Microsoft, consider saving that as a PDF or as a text file because those things can also be easily to open. Okay, so all of the things that we touched on today are actually a part of a DMP, a data management plan, which is a part of many federal grant proposals. Despite it being a required document to receive funding, it is above all a working guide to keep you and anyone you work with on track. So even if you don't have a grant application, but you're interested in maybe thinking about these questions for a project, you're working on, especially if you're working on with a project with other people. It might be worth exploring some data management plans that other people have written or templates that are out there to get a sense of, some guiding things to think about. And you can put this sort of active working document together so that it can guide your decisions throughout your project. And so you don't have to second guess who is supposed to do the backup, how often, who is responsible for transferring this file into an open format, things like that. Any questions for me so far? Okay, great. Well, in that case, I'm gonna end it here. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this workshop helps you feel more confident about some steps you can take to better manage your data and some questions you can ask yourself as you're moving through your project timeline. I'm gonna put a link in chat to the Google Drive that has these slides if you want to go through them or if you want to explore some of the questions. I'm also going to put a link into Experience WMU if that's how you found it and you want to say that you were here. That's something to keep in mind. Um, I know I threw a lot at you, and uh, if you would like to tell me what you thought of this workshop, any improvements I can make, or anything you would want to have in the future, there's going to be a post-workshop survey that you should get in an hour or so via email, and it will have an open text for what you liked the most about the workshop, but you can go ahead and feel free to put some other things in there, like improvements or what you'd like to see in the future. Um, in a few days, this recording will be available on YouTube, but I'd like to point your attention towards two workshops that are already up there um, that you might find useful if you want to take a deeper dive into some of these concepts. There's managing your data in spreadsheets if you want tips on preparing your tabular data for analysis, and data management planning, which will walk you through some data management questions about your project to consider, especially if you're working in a group or collaborating with others. And finally, if you need any additional personalized help, whether that's data management, creating a project, workflows, finding data, or anything else, feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to sit down with you and talk about your project, no matter where you are in your data lifecycle.